Hi, Rashonda here. This is Reading with Rashonda, and we are reading House Behind the Cedars by Charles Chesnutt. We are on chapter 7. It's a short little thing, so we will finish it and let's get started. Chapter 7, Mid-New Surroundings. Warwick's residence was situated in the outskirts of the town. It was a fine old plantation house. He lived in a plantation house. It was a fine old plantation house built in colonial times with a stately colonnade, excuse me, wide verandas and long windows with Venetian blinds. It was painted white and stood back several rods from the street in a charming setting of palmettos, magnolias, and flowering shrubs. Rena had always thought her mother's house large, but now it seemed cramped and narrow in comparison with this roomy mansion. The furniture was old-fashioned and massive. The great brass andirons on the wide hearth stood like sentinels proclaiming and guarding the dignity of the family. Interesting. Proclaiming and guarding the dignity of the family. And what is giving this family dignity? Is it that they look white? Is it something intrinsic? Does it need to be proclaimed and guarded? All right. I'll keep going. The spreading antlers on the wall testified to a mighty hunter in some past generation. The portraits of Warwick's wife's ancestors, high-featured, proud men and women dressed in the fashions of a bygone age, looked down from tarnished gilt frames. It was all very novel to her and very impressive. When she ate off china with silver knives and forks that had come down as heirlooms, escaping somehow the ravages and exigencies of the wartime, Warwick told her afterwards how he had buried them out of reach of friend or foe. She thought that her brother must be wealthy, and she felt very proud of him and of her opportunity. The servants, of whom there were several in the house, treated her with a deference to which her 8 months in school had only partly accustomed her. At school, she had been one of many to be served and had herself been held to obedience. Here, for the first time in her life, she was mistress and tasted the sweets of power. So there was a sentence I wanted to go back to. She thought that her brother must be wealthy, and she felt very proud of him and her opportunity. She felt that her brother must be wealthy. I actually didn't think much about his wealth, and I assumed he probably was wealthy. But the fact that it just got pointed out pulls that into question for me. What is going on here? All right. And she felt very proud of him and of her opportunity. This idea of her getting an opportunity from her brother has been repeated and repeated and repeated. So let's just keep our eyes open on that and see what comes of it. And then the last sentence of this paragraph, here for the first time in her life, she was mistress and tasted the sweets of power. So we all know the phrase power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like I said in the beginning, I really don't remember what happens in this book, so it's like I'm reading it fresh with you, but let's see what happens. The household consisted of her brother and herself, a cook, a coachman, a nurse, and her brother's little son, Albert. Finally, somebody talked about his kid. Like, he brought her here to help take care of his kid. Then he sends her away to school for a year where she can't help take care of his kid. Who was taking care of his kid while she was away at school? And why do we never hear anything about him? Yay, finally. His name's Albert. All right. The household consisted of her brother and herself, a cook, a coachman, a nurse, and her brother's little son, Albert. The child, with a fine instinct, had put his puny arms to Rena at first sight, and she had clasped the little man to her bosom with a motherly caress. She had always loved weak creatures. Kittens and puppies had ever found a welcome and a meal at Rena's hands, only to be chased away by Miss Molly, who had a wider experience. No shiftless poor white, no half-witted or hungry Negro had ever gone unfed from Miss Molly's kitchen door if Rena were there to hear his plaint. Little Albert was pale and sickly when she came, but soon bloomed again in the sunshine of her care and was happy only in her presence. Well, that's disturbing. The only time he's happy is when he's with Rena. I mean, I'm glad he's happy when he's with Rena, but not with his dad. He doesn't have friends. Like, what's going on? Warwick found pleasure in their growing love for each other and was glad to perceive that the child formed a living link to connect her with his home. "That child certainly do love Miss Rena, and that's a fact, shows you're born," remarked Lissa the cook to Mimey the nurse one day. "You'll get your nose put out of joint if you don't mind." I just didn't remember reading about a nurse, so I went back to the sentence that said who was in the household. "I ain't frettin', honey," laughed the nurse good-naturedly. She was not at all jealous. She had the same wages as before, and her labors were materially lightened by the aunt's attention to the child. This gave Mommy much more time to flirt with Tom the coachman. His name is Tom. I mean, lots of people are named Tom, but surely we're supposed to think of Uncle Tom's Cabin with a servant named Tom who lives in a plantation that's painted white. Like, aw. And we painted the plantation white. It was a source of much gratification to Warwick that his sister seemed to adapt herself so easily to the new conditions. Her graceful movements, the quiet elegance with which she wore even the simplest gown, the easy I am got something stuck in my throat. I'm struggling. Thank you for bearing with me. All right, let's start that sentence again. Her graceful movements, the quiet elegance with which she wore even the simplest gown, the easy authoritativeness with which she directed the servants, were to him proofs of superior quality, and he felt correspondingly proud of her. He's not just proud of her because she is and because she's his sister. She has to prove her superior quality, and then she will be proud. I'm not saying those aren't things to be proud of. Well, maybe in this context, I'm not sure. But I guess what I'm saying is I'm proud of my brother. He is my brother, and I love him, and I'm proud of him. Now, he's great at a lot of things, and so that heightens my pride, but I was already proud. Like, I feel like that's missing here. His feeling for her was something more than brotherly love. He was quite conscious that there were degrees in brotherly love, and that if she had been homely or stupid, he would never have disturbed her in the stagnant life of the house behind the Cedars. Dang. There had come to him from some source down the stream of time a rill of the Greek sense of proportion, of fitness, of beauty, which is indeed but proportion embodied, the perfect adaptation of means to ends. He had perceived more clearly than she could have appreciated it at the time the undeveloped elements of discord between Rena and her former life. He had imagined her lending grace and charm to his own household. Still another motive, a purely psychological one, had more or less consciously influenced him. He had no fear that the family secret would ever be discovered. He had taken his precautions too thoroughly, he thought, for that. Except for he's outing himself to the judge at their old home. That doesn't even make any sense. And yet he could not but feel at times that if peradventure it was a conceivable hypothesis, it should become known, his fine social position would collapse like a house of cards. Because of this knowledge, which the world around him did not possess, he had felt now and then a certain sense of loneliness. And there was a measure of relief in having about him one who knew his past, and yet whose knowledge, because of their common interest, would not interfere with his present or jeopardize his future. For he had always been, in a figurative sense, a naturalized foreigner in the world of wide opportunity, and Rena was one of his old compatriots whom he was glad to welcome into the populous loneliness of his adopted country. Wow, that a whole ton happened there. Okay, let's go back to the Greek sense of proportion. Like, I am intrigued that we're going back to ancient Greece. Like, we've gone back to the times of knights and jousts. Chesnutt is taking us back to ancient Greece. These are the things that, at the time, modern American ideals of dignity, of life, of beauty, of intelligence were founded. So he's just, Chesnutt being he, is just layering these things over and over. And then we have this sentence that closes out this chapter. For he had always been, in a figurative sense, a naturalized foreigner in the world of wide opportunity. He had always been, in a figurative sense, a naturalized foreigner. So he's a foreigner because he's a Black man, and that is really not making him an American. So he's a foreigner in his own country, but he's naturalized. So even though he wasn't born a citizen, I mean, he was, right? But in the scope of things, if you weren't white, and particularly male, you weren't a citizen. And he wasn't born white, so he wasn't born a citizen, which makes him a foreigner, but he's a naturalized foreigner. He is somebody who has learned our customs and learned the customs and ways and has become a naturalized citizen, which is truly a thing that happens. People can become US citizens through the naturalization process. So that phrase, a naturalized foreigner, just really jumped out at me. I'm like, and what are your rights as a naturalized citizen? I honestly don't know. I assume that you have all of the exact same rights as everybody, except for you can't be president. If there's anything else, I don't know what it is. And I probably learned it in a civics class, but I don't recall. But like, that's interesting here too. So he's a naturalized foreigner who by all looks and everything is a for real citizen, but there's going to be something that he can't get to. The next phrase in the sentence is, in the world of wide opportunity. So for he had always been, in a figurative sense, a naturalized foreigner in the world of wide opportunity. So here again is opportunity. And I mean, that's the American myth, right? The opportunity to be who you want to be. And Rena was one of his old compatriots. Okay, like a sister in arms, a friend, whom he was glad to welcome into the populous loneliness of his adopted country. The populous loneliness. I love the juxtaposition of those two words. Their lives are full of people. They are populous. And I also have to think of the political ideology of populism here. But their world is also lonely. Despite the number of people around them, they can't be real with anybody, at least not fully transparent, because then their secret may come out. And then he ends it into the populous loneliness of his adopted country. And that takes us back to the naturalized foreigner. So, wow, that was honestly a whole heap of fascinating things that happened here. So that was chapter 7 in The House Behind the Cedars by Charles Chesnutt. This is Reading with Rashonda, and I'm Rashonda Cade.